budgeted amounts from last year, and professional services down 32%. Some other assumptions, pending council approval, the mayor has requested a wage freeze for all non-represented staff. And then we are continuing discussions with the represented employee groups. We can't really get into that tonight, but we wanted to let you know that those discussions are continuing. And again, we're doing the full accounting for the cemetery costs. The general fund does provide a subsidy to cover the full costs of maintaining the cemetery.
What do you mean by full accounting for cemetery costs?
I think in the past years, we haven't shown the full FTE coverage that should be in the cemetery. For instance, we have an employee at some facilities, he's FTE is a 0.5, but really half of that time he's spending in cemetery work. We haven't done that, so indirectly we've always been subsidizing cemetery expenses. We just haven't shown it on paper, and this year we want to start doing that.
Okay, thank you.
And I think that brings us to utility funds. As we mentioned earlier, we are going to have on the 8th workshop, a continued budget workshop, and a utility rate workshop where we'll have the final report from FCS, and also have the example bills. But this budget went with the assumption that those rate increases will be approved. Again, 13.5 for water, 28.5 for sewer, 14.5 for storm. And then as we discussed during the FCS presentation, that does include the increase in utility tax for the fire suppression system. And the next slide shows how that works out. And basically what we're doing is we're pulling the fire suppression, increasing pipe capacity and the maintenance of the fire hydrants out of the rate and paying for those costs out of the fire fund, and then increasing the utility tax to offset those costs. And again, that's the legal recommendation of the folks that have analyzed the Supreme Court ruling on that. So that's what we're recommending for the utility funds. Let's go on. We constrain these expenses as well, but they do include investing in the system improvements for the East Street water line and the Zone 4 reservoir. And those were included again in the FCS presentation, and those are necessary improvements. That brings us to our key investments. The assumptions that we went with were filling the vacant police officer position. Again, we're budgeting for this to be a cost neutral position because it is a traffic position. But that could have the potential, not knowing what the courts do with tickets that we issue. We just want to let you know that we're budgeting for it to be cost neutral, but just have that caveat out there that some things are outside our control, but we do anticipate that covering the cost of itself. We're allocating $55,000 for economic development to invest in the future of Washougal, and we're going to fund high priority equipment purchases and begin funding the ER&R equipment replacement and repair funds. Again, we've put off purchases of necessary equipment in the past, and it's becoming pretty pertinent that we replace some of those things this year and really get a procedure in place to ensure that we can continue to replace those items as necessary in the future.
I have a question for you about that. Now, there was going to be some work done about trying to nail down exactly how much cost that was going to be. Where are we in that process? Is that going to be a long-term project, or?
It will be probably end of the year, beginning first quarter next year before we really get through that process. Unfortunately, we don't have enough time to get that done before the budget, but we are estimating and we will get that to you by the end of first quarter. Okay. Our budget also, or the mayor's budget also includes, can't talk now, funding community support services, Washougal School District, Community Education Program, the Children's Home Society, and also funding West Columbia, providing income to West Columbia Gorge Humane Society. Another investment is in regards to the EMS funds, the Emergency Management Service funds. Again, those are restricted revenues, and I'm actually going to turn the presentation over to Dave quickly for this portion.
As you know, we receive restricted EMS revenues, restricted to EMS services in the community. We are establishing a fund, we're proposing that we establish a fund beginning in 2011 to account for those separately as opposed to having those housed in a reserve in the general fund, if you would. And so we are making some investments. Some of the monies in that fund are what we've called in the past the supplanting dollars because of the declining assessed value and the rate, and all of that Paul explained. There's some funds that were sitting there, but again, restricted. So we are investing in EMS services in the community, in apparatus equipment and facilities. Specifically, we're looking at a medical response unit. That would be for Washougal. And then if there is a consolidation, depending upon what happens with our consolidation discussion, that would be, put back into that system. Looking at some AEDs, some automatic external defibrillators, several of those to deploy at our school, I believe, at some of our schools.
City Hall as well.
And City Hall. Hopefully you're all familiar with those devices. We can even get some training, but they're becoming more common in communities and they save lives. It's an excellent use of these restricted revenues. We're also looking at, in conversations with East County Fire and Rescue and Camas around Station 95 on the east side. It's looking like we might be bringing something to you sometime soon about leasing that facility from East County and having Camas housed there, continuing to have them housed there, but we would become more engaged in that piece. Again, appropriate use of the EMS funds. So that takes care of the first bullet. The second bullet is kind of a new situation that we need to give a little bit of attention and explanation for. As you know, we have an interlocal agreement between ourselves and Camas, and the last time that was updated was in 2008. And essentially that provides for Camas supplying a locally stationed and staffed advanced life safety ambulance 24 hours a day in Washougal. The interlocal agreement is not cost specific as to exactly what that costs and then what we would remit to pay for that. Rather, the interlocal agreement provides that Washougal will remit to Camas a proportionate share of our EMS levy and the full revenues from the levy lift. So it's a revenue-based remittance as opposed to a cost-based remittance, if you would. Camas also receives revenue from ambulance billings from Washougal calls, so it's revenue attributable to Washougal when they're billing users of the system. In 2008, when this was last updated, the interlocal agreement was last updated, those revenues were an adequate contribution to the system by Washougal. So I think that's why it was a revenue-based agreement as opposed to a cost-based agreement. But as you can imagine, the same crisis, if you would, that's hitting communities across the country is hitting our EMS system. Declining assessed valuation, the primary culprit. It's hurting the revenues that go into that system. East County is withdrawing from that system. And so Camas, as the host of that service, has had to take, as we have with our budget,